All right, good morning, BritLit scholars. Today is March 25th, Wednesday. I am making this to go over some of the things we're going to cover in today's class on Wednesday. And I'm looking at this document I've shared with all of you in which I will compile and keep track of all the different things that we're doing each day in class. And I want to talk a little bit about an article that I signed on Tuesday for you to do a little homework assignment on the Industrial Revolution and how it's connected to the Romantic era. Reading some of your homeworks, now not everybody's turned it in at the moment, but it's technically not due yet. But I wanted to maybe point you, and I tried to signal some of the more important points of the article with some highlighting. So I just want to go through the important things that I want you to pull from this. And let's talk about industrialization and the effect that it had on agriculture. Obviously, machines made farming a lot easier and more lucrative for those who could afford those machines. What happened then when agriculture became more industrialized was that they realized that it made more money to do single crops, and that in the old system, before all of this new farming equipment, there were a lot of people that you might think of as peasants or these rustic, sort of common folk that lived in rural situations. Maybe there was a tenant, or they were tenant farmers, as in they were able to work the land, do crafts such as weaving, or maybe making wheels for wagons. That's maybe they were joiners or carpenters, but they were allowed to live in a rural setting and sort of live off the land to some extent if they had an arrangement with somebody who owned the land. And this was very, very common. So you had a vibrant and rich rural population. And that all changed, though, when these landowners realized, hey, we could make a bunch more money if we clear the land and we just do single crop farms. And this led to something called the Enclosure Acts. And I want to just put that, this is the most important term, I think, in the article. This base essentially forced all of these rural inhabitants, these poor, I mean, they were maybe, they weren't liquid in terms of their assets, but they were rich in terms of their history, rich in their knowledge of how to live off the land, rich in understanding how to make things. There's a whole lifestyle that was wrapped up in living in the rural UK back in these days. But when they were forced off of these lands and forced into urban centers due to single crop farming, that created a massive shift in the way that the poor could exist. And not to say there wasn't a lot of poverty beforehand, but this made life tough for lots of folks. So that's one important thing about the Enclosure Acts that I wanted you to gather from this article, was that English country people became dependent on daily wages, working for landlords as hired hands, or working in their cottages at spinning and weaving for merchants in towns. Because of the less labor-intensive nature of new methods of agriculture, however, many people found themselves without work and without a place to live. So where did they have to go? They had to go into urban centers. And why was that? Well, because business was booming for the upper middle class. The article mentions a few other developments that came out of this age of invention and industrialization. And a lot of people thought, like, this is going to mean a better life for humanity. We were on track to figuring it all out. Um, so there's a reference to all these different sort of developments happening here. I think they're interesting if want to look into some of these inventions, like having to do with certain weaving practices and textile machines. Um, Now, as a result, then, after people were sort of kicked off of the countryside, um, there were new centers of population, and they were highly industrialized. Um, Let me read real quick. Because town officials would not gain the authority to incorporate their cities until later on in the Municipal Corporations Act of 1835, they lacked the power to manage growth. So these new population centers were drab, disorganized, dirty, and blackened by coal smoke. Housing was poorly made and densely packed. Sanitation and sewers were practically non existent. Since mill work was unskilled, wages were usually too low to support a family. Women and children were used extensively as laborers in the mills and in the coal industry. Laborers worked 14-hour days, and because there were many more people than jobs available, unemployment was rampant. Long days of working, children working. It was essentially a type of slave labor. Um, I'm not going to say it was exactly like slave labor, but and there wasn't a lot of choice in what these people could do. And imagine if you had been you know, generations upon generations um, of your ancestors had lived this rural lifestyle, and then all of a sudden you have to leave that country, to some extent an idyllic existence, although simple, still kind of meaningful, and then you're thrust into these dirty, industrialized, um, coal blackened situations that were very unhealthy, um, that was very disruptive and traumatizing. So, what does all of this have to do with the Romantic era that we've been talking about, or we've been talking around and approaching these last couple of days? And the thing is, the Romantics, and we're talking artists, musicians, poets, even philosophers, some psychologists, some early psychology came out of the Romantic era as well. Um, so when this movement of independent thinkers challenged what was happening with industrialization, they saw the effects of the depopulation of rural areas and the impoverishment and demoralization of the people who were left behind in the earliest phases of the Industrial Revolution. And so they wrote about that. You don't need to know all these particular names. I will point you to some of these poets that we will read about later on. So the goal, or the drive behind some of these early romantics, were to remind humanity about the power of nature, and to remind people, hey, look, this is what's being lost and left behind. We need to try to find more harmony, and there's a chaos and a social disruption happening through industrialization. So this lack of harmony, okay, and the existence of this very chaotic, very messy, very poorly planned piling on of people in industrial urban zones, led to an outcry and a movement which some people even call like the first environmentalist movement. and that was the Romantics. And we're going to study some of those people. And John Keats would fall into that category when we read La Belle. And we're going to look at some other folks as well. So that's a quick little rundown of what I wanted you to take from this article. You've got it. Read it through again. Um, if if this sort of pointed you in the right directions, I hope it did. All right, I'm going to stop here, and I'll see you guys when I see you next. All right.